All right, and as promised, here we are with Dr. Michael Mann, climate scientist extraordinaire. Mike, could you give yourself an introduction in case there's any of our viewers who might not know who you are?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's great to be with you. I'm a science nerd who published a graph 20 years ago, known as the hockey stick graph, that placed me in the center of the very fractious public debate over human-caused climate change, and that actually sort of led me down a path very different from the one I originally envisioned, not just sort of in my laboratory crunching numbers on a computer, which is what I always loved doing as a scientist, but because of the attacks on my work, that sort of led me into the fray. And ultimately, I've embraced the role that's provided me to be part of the larger conversation, the larger societal conversation about human-caused climate change and what we can do about it. And so these days, while I continue to do science and teach and advise students and postdoctoral researchers, a lot of my time and effort is spent trying to communicate the science and its implications to the public and policymakers.
Yeah. So, I mean, in addition to being the hockey stick guy, you're also kind of one of the central figures in the whole ClimateGate thing. So, I mean, really, as far as anything that anyone in the general public has ever heard about climate change, you're kind of that guy.
Yeah,
you're either the villain or the hero, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Those two things aren't, unrelated. Of course, right. Part of the reason I was central in this assault on climate change was the larger effort to discredit my work and the iconic hockey stick graph. So it wasn't surprising that these stolen emails now come to what's come to be known as ClimateGate between various climate scientists around the world were taken out of context and misrepresented to try to, essentially to try to promote this fallacy that somehow scientists were trying to fudge the numbers or are engaged in a massive conspiracy and hoax. That sort of thinking is quite widespread, sort of in the fever swamps of the right-wing media and the climate change denial echo chamber and noise machine. It turns out that in polling that's been done, very few actual people, members of the public, heard about ClimateGate in the first case, although it was obviously trumpeted by climate change deniers. Most Americans never heard about it, and the ones that did have forgotten about it. So it remains sort of a footnote, and yet, again, within the fever swamp of sort of the climate change denial conspiracy machine, they will still cite these, out of context, cherry-picked emails to misrepresent the science and the scientists. The general public doesn't really care, mostly ignored it, but it does provide fodder for that fringe who deny the science and often have a politically motivated reason for doing so. So that includes, the climate change deniers out there on the internet, but it also includes, very sort of high-level policymakers, politicians who are closely allied with the fossil fuel industry and have used the myths of ClimateGate to try to create a smokescreen, fool the public, and prevent action on climate.
As I've mentioned many times, virtually my whole extended family is very conservative. And although I'm sure not one of them could recall a single detail about the whole ClimateGate thing, as you say, to a single person, they are persuaded that climate change was disproven a decade ago, and they think nobody even cares about it anymore. It just, everyone lives within their own little bubble, and so it was very, very effective.
I mean, Brian, as you know, Brian, we live in this world now of alternative facts and truly fake news, where there's a large segment of the population that is bombarded with myths, untruths, things that are factually wrong, but somehow sort of feed the tribal identity of the group that they're part of, and it's very difficult to penetrate that wall of that wall of epistemic closure that that these people are trapped in. I have argued that when you actually step back, and I don't know about your family members, but if you just look at the larger demographics of this, it's a really small percentage of the public. Now maybe 12% of the public are what you might call dismissives. People who actively deny, you make it a point to contest the science of climate change and to dismiss it as a hoax. It's a really small fraction of the public, but they have a voice that is out of proportion with their numbers because of the right-wing news machine, because of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal editorial pages. And so we hear a lot of this noise when in fact behind it is just a tiny fringe of the public. And that's why I argue that it's often best to just not engage with them, because you're not going to change their mind, and you're going to waste a whole lot of time and effort trying to do that, time and effort that would be better spent focused on the confused middle, the people who are victims of that misinformation, have heard the myths promoted by climate change deniers, are honestly confused, and with the tools of critical analysis, the things that we value as scientists, we can, they are reachable. We can explain the facts to them. We can bring them on board with the science.
I've found the same thing to be true. One of the main things I wanted to have you here today and wanted to ask you about was to help me answer a question that I almost always get whenever I do a Q&A or something at one of my talks. And people always want to know, what can I do, as an individual to help fight climate change? And obviously there's a lot of things that we can think of, but what I don't know, and what I really haven't been able to find out, is what is the best way? I mean, is it, a dollar only goes so far, and should you put solar on your house or should you donate to a political campaign? One or the other of those may have a vastly different impact at the end of the day, and I just don't know. Is there any data on this? I mean, do we have good answers for what should people do?
Yeah, I do think there's some good social science research, and I've tried to familiarize myself with that research, because this is an issue that I try to speak to. In fact, today I have a column that just went live on the Time Magazine news site, and it'll appear in Time Magazine in the print issue this weekend about this very matter, about the relative roles of personal action and collective action and systemic change. Okay. And the basic argument, to summarize it, very briefly, is sure, we should all do these things in our everyday lives, that save us money, they make us healthier, they make us feel better by, reducing our usage of electricity, buying more fuel-efficient vehicles, or using public transportation, recycling, reducing our use of raw materials. There are all these things that we can do that can make a bite. They can make a little bit of a dent in this problem, in the carbon emissions problem. But in the end, if we're going to see the large-scale behavioral changes that are necessary to make the sorts of massive reductions we need to in our carbon emissions, we need systemic change, we need collective action, we need politicians who will do our bidding rather than the bidding of the fossil fuel interests, who too often fund their campaigns. And so we need people, if you ask me what's the most important thing that somebody can do, is to use their voice in every way possible, including at the voting booth, to send a signal that we expect those in power, those in a position to actually make systemic change, to do what's right, to help us transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy, to get off carbon as fast as we can.
Yeah, that's kind of how I've been answering the question, is just, use your voice, talk with people, vote. But when people say, well, okay, but I've got some extra money this month, what should I do? And
yeah, and don't get me wrong, just to add one more sort of element to that, it is really important to do those things, even if they're not going to solve the problem on their own. When you take actions in your own life that are clearly intended to reduce your environmental footprint, it sends a message, right, to everybody around you. It sends a very powerful message.
It does, and that's not insignificant. What I find fascinating about this problem, though, is when we apply the science of economics to this. If you say, let's just pick something as an example. Let's say putting a solar panel on your house is a great thing to do, just as an example. And if we say that, well, it's to everyone's People always tell me this. They say it's in everyone's self-interest to address climate change. And that misstates economics. That's public interest, not self-interest. What self-interest would be is if we all start putting solar panels on our house, then the price of oil-generated electricity comes down, and then people will use their self-interest to start buying that. And the problem ends up not being impacted. So, and that's what, of course, we call the tragedy of the commons.
Right. That's why we need policies that align self-interest and the public interest, right? We need incentives that lead people to make the right decisions. Right.
Yeah. And you know, the plan has always been, oh, let's just tax the heck out of carbon emissions, right? And that would be wonderful. And the problem with that is, well, I mean, I don't even need to say it, is that becomes a political issue right there, because you've got one political party that favors less government regulation and another that favors more government regulation if it can, you know, go the right direction towards solving these problems. So I don't know. I'm just always find myself wondering, how can we get more people to be incentivized without politicizing it? And I don't have an answer for, because I mean, as you know so well, the political element is a negative force in this whole problem.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I do think there's a ray of hope here. In fact, there are some conservatives, like former Congressman Bob Inglis, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan Republican from South Carolina, and one of the reddest districts in South Carolina, had a nearly perfect lifetime conservative voting record. But as an evangelical Christian, he came to be convinced, including by his children, that we have a crisis here, and that he had to use, you know, his influence to try to do something. And he spoke out about the need to act on climate on the House floor, and found himself at the receiving end of a barrage of Koch brothers money in the next election, designed to get him primaried, to get him out of that seat. And now he travels around the country speaking to conservative audiences about how there are conservative vehicles for acting on climate, and real vehicles, not fake ones. Too often you hear, well, we'll just encourage innovation and that'll solve the problem.
Right.
Or we'll adapt. You know, those aren't legitimate solutions to the climate problem writ large. But, you know, what Bob Inglis will say is we need a price on carbon. Let's levy a carbon tax, but let's make it revenue neutral. So we will tax carbon, but, you know, given his politics, he would like to see that offset by a reduction in income tax. You know, and then progressives will come to the table. They'll say, well, no, we would like to take that revenue and sort of use it to compensate those who are most impacted by climate change, who have the least resources, and they have a much more progressive outlook on the problem. And hey, isn't that great? Isn't that the debate we should be having? We recognize we need to solve the problem. We need a price signal, because the economics, that's not politics, that's just economics. But how we do it is a matter of legitimate political debate. And I think it's great that you've got people like Bob Inglis, you know, putting forward his ideas. And so we have this marketplace of ideas, and I hope that that's what we're moving towards, where we will have good faith conservatives, you know, coming into the fold on this issue and saying, let's stop the science denial. Let's have a meaningful conversation about solving this problem. And you see some of them coming along. There's a little bit of movement in that direction. Not quite enough yet, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we might see something interesting happen there over the next few years.
Yeah, I mean, I live here in Central Oregon, which is generally very red.
Right.
And the incentives here are terrible for putting solar on your house. I was so excited. We have 9 acres here, and I wanted to do a big, giant ground-based solar array. And it quickly just turned out to be not even close to affordable. So I have no plans to do it. I wanted to get an electric car, as the state incentives are ridiculous here too. And there's a lot of public sentiment against changing that.
Right. And a lot of it is coming from those, you know, the Koch brothers and these polluting interests. They have bombarded, you know, state level politics with propaganda aimed at sort of dampening enthusiasm for renewable energy for electric vehicles, interfering with state level incentives and subsidies, and doing everything in their power to prevent this from happening, but they're fighting a losing battle. This is, just like if you were selling whale oil in the 1800s, that was a losing battle. There was a change afoot, and it was the dawn of the fossil fuel age. Something better came along. Now, guess what? Something better has come along than fossil fuels. That's renewable energy, and we're going to move in that direction.
So, I mean, obviously that raises the big question is how quickly that shift is going to happen, and where is that going to put us on 1.5 or 2 or 3 or?
Absolutely. Yep.
What's the latest and greatest on aren't you of the opinion that we've already passed 1.5? Or
we're very close. One of the things that we've pointed out in some of our scientific work is that the IPCC, which is often accused of being somehow this leftist organization, is actually overly conservative in the way they assess how much warming we've already had, because they start in the late 1800s. And something we've pointed out is, hey, there was a fair amount of human-caused greenhouse warming before that. The Industrial Revolution started back in the 1700s, and we don't have nearly as widespread measurements of temperature that far back, which is part of what's impeded the use of an earlier baseline. But we provided some ways of getting at that. And what we showed is that if you use a true pre-industrial baseline, like where we were in the mid-1700s, and you measure the warming relative to that baseline, it's now about 1.2, 1.3, and we're trying to avoid 1.5. Obviously, there's not a lot of wiggle room. We're warming at nearly 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. So that tells you that we hit that 1.5 pretty darn soon if we don't dramatically reduce carbon emissions. And that's been the conversation over the last year and a half or so. Can we still do that? What would be necessary to do that? And if we miss 1.5, which some people would define as dangerous interference, at the very least, we don't want to warm more than 2. And that's probably more readily achievable. But even there, we've got to act dramatically now if we're going to, avoid crossing even that threshold, where we really do see many of the worst potential impacts of climate change if we warm the planet more than about 2 degrees Celsius, 3.6 Fahrenheit.
So stopping or reducing, putting more carbon into the system is one thing. What about kind of crazy schemes people are talking about to see if we can remove it? Can we profitably remove carbon from the atmosphere or from the oceans? Do you see any possibility for significant help from any of those technologies?
Well, there is a possibility there. And in fact, implicit in many of the scenarios now for avoiding 1.5 degrees Celsius is that we actually go negative, is that we sort of overshoot our carbon budget. At the rate we're going, we'll do that very quickly. We overshoot our carbon budget. We expend too much carbon to keep the planet below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so we actually have to go negative within a couple decades, which, how do you go negative in carbon emissions? You literally suck the carbon back out of the atmosphere. You're fighting the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of economics in doing so. But it can be done. What's much cheaper, of course, is not burning that carbon in the first place. And so ironically, a bit of preventative action would have been far cheaper than this particular form of solution. Now, a carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture where you suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere is expensive. It's hard to do. It hasn't been demonstrated at scale yet. And so there's some question as to whether we can really do it at the scale necessary. With the right financial incentives, perhaps we could. But at least that is dealing with the problem at its source. Another proposal that you hear more and more about, and maybe you were about to ask me about this, is so-called geoengineering, where we engage in some other planetary scale manipulation of our environment in the hope that we can magically offset the warming effect of the pollution we're putting into the atmosphere in the first place.
With chemtrails, right?
There's so much confusion out there. With chemtrails, I don't even know if it's coming from the left or the right anymore. I can't tell. These people are just all over the place.
Well, it doesn't matter if it's coming from the left or the right. As has been observed, it doesn't matter what side of the mule you walk around. Go too far and you'll end up at the ass.
There you are, my friend.
I'm speaking at a plastics conference, in a week. Actually, by the time this airs, it'll be about a week ago. I spoke at a plastics conference, and one of the things that's interesting that they're big on is the technologies for, um, creating plastic out of thin air, literally, and also the idea is gaining traction in that industry that. Yes, we all agree the fossil fuel industry should die, but as long as that oil is coming up out of the ground, let's put it into plastic because that's a great way to sequester carbon. What do you think of the validity of that argument?
Yeah, it's an interesting argument. From what I've seen of the numbers, I mean, to do that again at a scale that makes sense, you're talking about if you take all of the petroleum that's currently used for fossil fuels and you continue to produce it, but use it for materials, for plastics, polymers, what have you, we're filling up the planet with stuff. I mean, it's just a massive amount of material that would be accumulating, and there's a real question about our ability to manage just sort of that sort of level of manufacturing of material. Where does it all go? Where does it get buried? I don't think that there, is a way out of this problem that doesn't, to some extent, get at the issue of consumption, consumption of natural resources. I don't really see a solution to the climate problem and all the other environmental problems that we face without targeting the issue of consumption. And that's why, reuse and reducing use of reducing use of energy and materials and increased efficiency is an important part of the solution. In California, in fact, a lot of their reductions in carbon emissions have actually come from increased efficiency. So we have to be thinking about that, being increasingly efficient with the materials we use and producing less materials than we need. Producing less materials, producing only the materials that we need, right, and not anymore.
Finding ways to need less.
Exactly.
It's definitely one of those issues that requires a very multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Kind of at every level. We need what do you call it? Sticks and honey. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Carrots and sticks.
Carrots and sticks.
Yeah.
Carrots and sticks.
Sounds good.
Taxes and incentives.
That's the whole thing. So there you are.
So let me just go back to the one question I asked you a few minutes ago. And pretend you're in front of an audience and you've got 30 seconds to answer the question of what should I do as an individual? I mean, I kind of need to develop a 30-second elevator pitch answer for this, and it's not going to be comprehensive, but what would you say for what that answer should be?
Yeah, I would say use your voice in every way possible. That means talking to people about this problem, raising awareness among your friends, your family members, expressing your will at the voting booth, voting for politicians who will act on this problem, getting rid of those politicians who won't, and making sure everybody else hears about it as well. Because without politicians who are willing to do what's right for us rather than the polluters, what's expedient for the polluters, we won't get the policy changes we need to fundamentally solve this problem.
Okay, there we have it. I'm noticing on the bookshelf behind you, you've got the Madhouse effect there.
Yes.
What's your most recent book? Is it that?
Actually, my most recent book, in terms of books that have actually been published, is a children's book that I co-authored. Yeah. The Tantrum That Saved the World.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you have a copy of it there you could grab?
It's hidden here.
Oh.
There we are. Tantrum That Saved the World.
So, how did this come about?
I met a children's author and illustrator, Meg Herbert, at a climate change workshop in Iceland some years ago. And we sort of met there, and we realized that we had this common interest in trying to educate young folks, and this was a natural way to try to do it. It actually presaged the children's climate movement. Greta Thunberg, who's become this sort of leading international figure in the climate movement, who, 16-year-old girl who's been lecturing, the politicians, policymakers about their failure to act, and has raised so much awareness and has really changed the conversation, along with, other children who've sort of joined in. And it's become this, international sort of a movement. And we like to think that maybe we had some role in that, because that's what the book actually describes: a girl who becomes frustrated by the animals that are showing up at her door, because they've been displaced by climate change. That's why they're showing up. And she throws a tantrum. She gets really upset about it, but ultimately she channels that emotion into positive action and becomes the change she wishes to see, and she changes the world. And that's what these kids are actually doing right now. That's one of the things that gives me optimism. So that's my most recent published book, but I'm working on my next book right now, and it's going to be, it will actually be announced next week.
A spy thriller?
No, oddly enough, I steered clear of that particular genre. I felt it didn't really take advantage of my knowledge base and writing style. Romance novels, they're out too. But what I am working on is a book that's sort of about the challenges we face now, what I call the new climate war, which, the forces of delay and denial have moved away from sort of the blatant outright denial of the science, because it just isn't credible anymore. People can see that something's happening. So they've sort of moved on to, in some ways, an almost more pernicious form of denial, softer denial, which is to downplay, the problem and to shoot down the solutions, whether it's renewable energy or anything else, to try to divert attention away from the need to do something about the problem, so that we continue with business as usual. And every day we continue with business as usual, the fossil fuel industry makes millions of dollars in profits. And so they're going to delay this using any tactic they can. And so what this book is going to do is sort of show people what these tactics are, so they can recognize. Among them is the fractious debate right now about personal action versus collective action. That isn't accidental.
Okay.
Fossil fuel interests want us arguing about that stuff. They want us at each other's throats about, eating cheeseburgers and flying and what's the right solution to the problem. Because as long as we're arguing with each other, we're not focused on the change that's necessary. So that's sort of what my book is about, the new challenges, the new climate war that's being waged, and how we can defeat the polluters and still prevail in this battle for the future of our planet.
Does it have a title yet? It sounds like the new climate wars is a
new climate wars, winning the new climate war.
Okay.
Is the title, and the subtitle is to be still potentially will be tweaked, but how to win the new climate war.
Well, just as there's a place for a children's book, I would argue that there is also a place for romance novels with this topic at the core to reach a whole new audience.
I'll keep that in mind, Brian. Thank you very much.
And I think that's where we're going to have to leave it on that note. Thank you so very much for spending this half hour with us here.
Brian, it was my pleasure.